Today, we will talk about one of the largest fort sieges in Appalachian history, the Siege of Fort Bates. Over the years, the siege has been buried to history because of political sensitivities and the people involved at that time. There are several reasons given for how the feud got started. As we have stated, these reasons vary from because of a series of misunderstandings, an attempted murder of Dick Vance, and the murders of Frank Salyers, Andy Hall, and Linville Higgins. When we last left the feud, Clabe Jones had gone to Hyman, Kentucky for help against Todd Hall and his gang. We will look at what happens next through the pages of documents and newspapers, as well as Jones as a witness to the events. For a full record of his testimony in this section of the feud, please see our Clabe Jones video, Jones and the Shootout at Fort Bates. These events take place in 1892 through 1885. All aboard the Kentucky-Tennessee Living Time Machine. Please fasten your seatbelts and keep your arms and legs inside of the vehicle at all times. But to get going, we need your help. We will still need to fire up the time machine to transport us. Please help us by clicking on the like, subscribe, and bell notification buttons down below. Not only does this fire up the time machine, but it convinces YouTube that we need a bigger time machine to reach more people who love history as much as you do. Now, back to our story. Attempted murder of Dick Vance. According to Jones, there had been an attempt on Dick Vance's life by the Todd Hall gang. This was because Vance was also a moonshiner that was facing federal charges for moonshining in Catlettsburg, which is located in Boyd County, Kentucky. Vance had been staying in a room with John Adams from Letcher County, Kentucky. Due to Vance not being able to sleep that night, he saw one of Hall's spies enter his room, strike a match, and look at his face. Vance let the spy leave the room and went to a separate part of the hotel to go to bed. This saved John Vance's life, as not long after that, John Adams' sleeping body was hurled out of a third-floor story window by Todd Hall, Uriah Bates, and Andy Hall. Adams had been shackled by both hands and feet as he was on the way to Louisville, Kentucky to face federal charges. There are sources that state that Adams had jumped out of the window on his own accord to escape the charges. These sources claim that Todd Hall was on guard duty at that time. Several other sources state that Adams was murdered as it was a case of mistaken identity. Death of Andy Hall and Linville Higgins. One of the suggested starting points of the feud comes from the deaths of Andy Hall and Linville Higgins. We do have a record of Linville's death taking place on August 15, 1884. Upon the return of Vance to Knott County from federal court, Vance waylaid and shot Andy Hall from a hidden spot in the brush. The Linville Higgins Find a Grave source states that Vance shot Hall while he was climbing a fence with a sack of potatoes on his back. It is thought that Linville Higgins and Andy Sloan also participated in the shooting of Andy Hall. It was not long after the death of Andy Hall that Linville Higgins was murdered. According to the Appalachian Quarterly, September 1998, quote, Old Dave Hall, father of Talton Hall, had been considered as a suspect in the murder of Linville Higgins. However, Dave Hall, who was also father of Andrew Hall, had no part in the killing other than possibly relishing the death of one of the gang that had murdered his son. 3 men were indicted for the Higgins murder, one of which was positively identified as Wash Craft of Letcher County. 2 other suspects were Sam Wright and Benjamin Jones, unquote. According to the Linville Higgins Find a Grave source, quote, 3 men were identified for the Higgins murder, one of which was positively identified as Wash Craft of Letcher County. 2 other suspects were Sam Wright and Benjamin Jones. Sam, known as, quote, kinky-haired Sam, unquote, was the son of Joel E. and Eliza Wright, and brother of Devil John Wright. It is also mentioned that William S. Wright was implicated in this murder. W.S. was the son of Sidney Wright and cousin of Devil John. Unquote. We will swing back around to this event next week as John Wright would face off against Deputy Sheriff Dolph Drawn and enter the feud. Missed opportunities. According to the autobiography of Clabe Jones, the first missed opportunity to capture Hall came when Vance, Jones, and their men were within 40 yards of Hall sitting in his yard reading a newspaper. It began to snow, and so Hall walked into Fort Bates, and the men had to give up the hunt. Hall got wind that the men were after him and went to Fort Wright for safety, and only returned when the men put out a rumor that they had left for Ohio. The second missed opportunity came when Hall, dressed in Salyers' clothing and driving his oxen, passed by the party unrecognized. His identity was later confirmed by Jones and German Isaacs. The group was able to gather 5 more men from the Isaacs family and returned for another try to arrest Hall. The Fort Bates Siege. According to the Hazel Green Herald, dated June 3, 1885, Hall did get wind that Jones had gotten warrants out for himself, Bates, and Johnson for the murder of Frank Salyers, and he was going to get even with him for that action. Little did he realize that Jones did not come alone, but had gathered up close to 30 men in number to come after him. Sometime in late May of 1885, the Jones faction of the feud had pushed the Hall faction into Fort Bates. According to the same source, quote, a few days ago, the Hall party had driven into a house by Jones and his men, and since then the war has been waged in earnest. Hall and his men are still fortified in a house which is surrounded by Jones and his followers. On several occasions, Hall party attempted to fight their way out, but were driven back. Unquote. This was not without a heavy price to be paid. At least 5 men on the Jones side were killed and several others were wounded. Everyone that lived near Fort Bates was running for their houses in safety and wouldn't come out. Many calls came from Fort Bates for help in breaking up the siege, but no help would come. But on the Jones side, the party was being reinforced daily. Mack Hall and Ab Little. We know some information about the shootout at Fort Bates in which Todd Hall was wounded. We can get a little more detail about the events surrounding the deaths of Mack Hall and Abner Little from the Daily Evening Bulletin dated December 21, 1885. Quote, in the fight, Mack Hall was first shot in the leg and Abner Little was killed while trying to rescue him. Unquote. However, according to the Valley Virginian, dated September 8, 1892, and other sources, Mack Hall would die of these injuries a few days later. Todd Hall is reported as laughing at the news of the death of his cousin in the face of Jones, who was there to arrest him. These deaths seemed to be the last straw for Jones and his faction, as they decided to end this siege once and for all. You can view Clabe Jones' version of these events in the video, Clabe Jones and the Shootout at Fort Bates. The Last Shootout. Jones gathered his men and ammo and went to finish the job once and for all. Nell Bates, Todd Hall's sister, stepped outside of the fort to see if Jones and his men were there. She went back into her home all of a sudden, and all of the men were running out of the back door with their guns in hand. Jones hollered for everyone to stop as they were all under arrest. The Hall faction began shooting at this point. Shots rang out for quite a while between the two factions as they were determined to end the other faction once and for all. At one point in the exchange, Todd Hall had been shot in the shoulder, staggered, and Nell Bates grabbed him and threw him into the fort for safety. In the middle of the battle, Todd Hall's wife, Renda Hall, came out on the front porch and climbed onto the fence and exclaimed, quote, hurrah for old Clabe Jones! Kill all of them, and that damn Salyer woman too. Unquote. Jones called back to her saying that is what he was intending to do. There came a point in the battle when the men realized that their ammo and guns were not strong enough to penetrate the thick logs of Fort Bates, and so they stopped shooting. All was laid quiet over the night, and the Hall faction was able to escape the fort and run to Fort Wright and get help from John Wright. This did not go over well with the governor of the state of Kentucky. He offered a reward of $500 for the capture and arrest of Todd Hall and each of his men. Jones was appointed as special bailiff to arrest them. The death of Elkerton Turner. Between June 1885 and July 14, 1891, not so much as a peep has been heard from Todd Hall, as he had been separated from his men, so the Jones faction presumed that he was dead from his wounds. But Dr. Spence helps to fill in a little bit of the time gap in the Todd Hall story. He begins to tell a newspaper reporter from the Roanoke Times dated June 24, 1892, about the history of Todd Hall. He also tells the reader about the Turner-Sizemore feud that had taken place. According to Dr. Spence, two of the Elkerton Turner's sons had got into a fight down on Beaver Creek, Kentucky. Todd Hall went to a neighbor's and stole a Winchester rifle and the neighbor's daughter. Elkerton Turner was acting as an officer of the law and executing a warrant for the kidnapping of the girl that had been sworn out against Hall by her father. Hall was not about to go quietly, and a shootout ensued whereupon Turner was killed and Hall was severely wounded. Hall had once again escaped justice, and no trace could be found of him except in the mountain caves, where there was evidence of his wounds being dressed by his friends. According to the Evening Bulletin dated December 18, 1891, quote, "Sometimes afterward, Hall was reported killed by one of the Jones factions, and it was a long time before he was heard of. He finally turned up at Norton, Virginia, where he had killed an officer while resisting arrest. He fled and eluded the officer until a few days ago when he was captured in Memphis," unquote. In our next video, the feud is not over yet by a long shot. Over the next 6 years, there would be skirmishes all over Letcher, Floyd, and Knott County concerning these factions. There were many in Floyd, Knott, and Letcher counties that were afraid to come out of their doors. Sheriff Deputy Dolph Drawn will enter the feud against all three sides. John Wright will send a message to Jones declaring sanctuary to the men who escaped Fort Bates, and how this would lead to the siege of Fort Wright and the eventual capture of Black Hawk Sizemore, Billy D. Hall, and Miles Bates, and the planned surrender of the rest of the Hall faction. Thank you. We at Kentucky, Tennessee Living would like to thank you for watching our video series on the Appalachian feuds. Don't forget to hit that like button, as the more likes we receive, the more likely YouTube is to suggest our videos to other viewers. Also, to receive notice when we upload a new video, be sure to subscribe and click the bell notifications. We thank you for continuing to support Kentucky, Tennessee Living as we are discovering the mysteries of Appalachian history.